S opened her mouth wide and, wiping sweat from her face, asked what they should find here. Dokja, without taking his eyes off the museum, answered that they should find Kang Pong Yui. The main character remembered how in museums, there was a gold-colored disc hanging behind glass, and added that it was an object similar to a disc from the Joseon era. But he didn't know what floor it was on. He needed to find it as soon as possible, so they needed to split up. Gil would go with Sam. The main character turned his head sharply and was just about to say something when he saw a red beam flying straight at them. A moment later, he jumped on his squad and shouted for everyone to get down on the floor. Dokja began to quickly draw his sword, carefully stared at the red arrows flying at him, and shouted for everyone to go inside quickly. The main character quickly deflected the arrows, gritted his teeth furiously, and thought that these were magic arrows, and the skill was excellent. Who was it? A moment later, the stranger opened his mouth wide. The main character added in his head that there really was someone who knew about their movements and shouted, "Where is the king?" Sucker Ran Van spread his arms wide. A huge number of archers stood behind him, and he shouted that the main character needed to give the flag if he wanted to live. He would even spare his allies. The main character saw a screen below him with a description of the character. Dokja began to quickly dodge the arrows and, slightly gritting his teeth, thought that who would have thought that here he would meet Master Chu Wangin. But from this idiotic manner of speech, it was clear why he was only hired for minor roles and why General Kabik chose him. Van spread his arms wide, stretched out his shoulders, and looked at him with a wide smile on the protagonist's face. The main character added in his head that, even though he is a Su incarnation, Sigma is at a high level. If you don't add skill points, it will be problematic to cope with him alone. However, he needs the coins for the last phase of the scenario. One of the arrows hit the protagonist in the shoulder, and Dokja, looking carefully at the wound, clenched his teeth in pain. The main character began to quickly chop down all the arrows flying at him, and looking carefully at his balance of almost 70,000, wondered what if he spent 20,000. Guan sharply pulled her hand back and shouted that he was hiding behind the name of the 3 states and would attack the weak. Isn't he ashamed? Van clenched his teeth and looked at the beauty queen carefully. Dokja opened his eyes in surprise and stared at the queen. Wang froze in front of Guan, who had a large army behind her. Guan relaxedly looked at the master of Chu Wangin and noticed what else could be expected from the commander of a collapsed state. Wang, smiling broadly, asked what the queen forgot here. Jiwon and the army began to approach the side of the protagonist, and Dokja, carefully staring at the opponents, wondered where the beauty queen had come from again. Was she really following him? This couldn't be happening. The main character turned his head sharply at her and saw a notice in front of him that Jiwon was interested in him. Dokja gritted his teeth slightly and looked at the beauty queen frozen. Jiwon stood next to the protagonist, glanced toward the enemy, and said that he was right. You can't buy a person. She came to make amends, that's all. So let her not pay attention. Dokja, sweating, stared attentively at the queen. Then he looked at the queen with a slight smile and noticed that she had fallen for some loser and that nothing else was interesting. One of the beauty queen's soldiers came forward and shouted that it was rude. How dare he talk to the queen like that? The Chu Wangin ballmaster put his hand to his chin, smiled sarcastically, and said that someone had really entered into a contract with this constellation of sludge. Guan opened her eyes wide and heard that she also wanted to come with her head cut off, like her constellation sponsor. Kek opened his mouth wide and shouted at him to shut up. The main character looked straight, attentively lowered his eyelids slightly, and thought that, of course, he was grateful that she came to the rescue. But why exactly did they have to collide? Dokja carefully looked at how the beauty queen's warrior stood and looked at Master Chu Wangin and added in his head that this is a well-known story in the Battle of Chu Wangin. Chong was beheaded by General Kevi. The hierarchy of constellations is based on their past life. The main character gritted his teeth, looking furiously, and said that they just needed to retreat with the army. They could not be defeated. He added in his head that the commander cannot be higher than the ruler, and the relationships of longtime enemies are formed on the basis of historical records. The closer the relationship of the sponsor with the incarnation, the more it manifests itself. A moment later, the protagonist and the beauty queen slowly turned around as the protagonist's name was called. San and Gil began to run out of the museum, and the protagonist's colleague raised her hand with the disc and shouted that she had found it. The main character looked carefully at the disc in the girl's hand and thought that it was just in time. Dokja bent down slightly, looked straight ahead, and thrusting his sword forward, shouted that now they had a chance to win. They needed to repeat the Battle of Chu Wangin Ball. Wang sharply straightened his arm forward after activating the stigma of controlling the special forces and shouted, "Into battle!" The army of the beauty queen froze for defense, and Dokja noticed in his head that this is a well-known story. Silla won the Battle of Chu Wangin Ball. The main character again imagined a diagram of metro stations in his head. The main character remembered a picture of the Battle of Chu Wangin Ball in which two armies clashed with each other and said that in the year 660, a battle between the combined forces of Silla and the Tang dynasty under the command of a general named Kim Yusen and the Beek army under the command of General Beck took place. The warrior beauty queen curled up slightly, and Dokja noticed in his head that young H. Warren Kwan sacrificed himself for the sake of Silla's victory. General Job also lost his life in that battle. The beauty queen's warrior opened her mouth wide, put out a spear in front of her, and shouted that they need to move forward. Their army is sincerely loyal to the queen. After his words, a notification appeared that said that all H wearing Silla received the bonus effect of the 5 commandments. Wang put his hand with the sword in front of him, opened his mouth wide, and shouted that it looks like they want to say goodbye to life. We need to destroy these cockroaches from Silla. After his words, a notification appeared that said that Wang's character had activated the stigma of Kondo Beach. Both squads of warriors flew at each other. The main character turned sharply to the beauty queen and shouted that it was necessary to retreat now. It was impossible for Kwan to clash with General Quebec. Jiwon opened her mouth wide and, slightly sweating, shouted for the warriors to go back. After her words, the notification reported that the character, the beauty queen, activated the skill to control military forces. The beauty queen looked carefully at her squad, and seeing that no one heard her order, repeated that she ordered to retreat. The notification reported that using the skill was impossible. The soldiers lost their minds. Van struck the warrior girl in the stomach with a sharp and powerful blow, and she looked at him in horror and unsuccessfully dodged. The main character gritted his teeth, looked straight ahead fiercely, and noted in his head that one guy named Kwang Chang was not enough. However, the scene was about to appear, and the beauty queen opened her mouth wide in horror and looked gloomily at the notice that said that the constellation, lady on silk sheets, nervous. A moment later, the world around began to crack into blue squares. Duck turned sharply, looked in horror at how the world was cracking, and shouted, "What was happening? What was happening to the environment?" The main character turned to this, opened his mouth slightly, and wondered what had begun. A staging. Wang spread his arms wide. The warrior girl fell to her knees and grabbed her stomach, and opening her mouth shouted that he missed H. Wangin Ball. A notification that appeared said that the constellation, the last hero of H. Wangin Ball, was delighted. The main character noticed in his head that for the staging, they needed incarnations that have a strong connection with their sponsor and constellations that were at war in the past. When the conditions are met, the battle is transferred to the place where the battle originally took place. The main character turned his head sharply, thought that in fact this is an ordinary scenery, but for those participating in the scene, everything is different, and slightly opened his mouth and noticed that perhaps this is because Kek, the main character in this scene, and Hook, with his mouth wide open, turned to the protagonist with a nervous smile and said that he was not even a king, but had more than enough strength. After these words, the beauty queen became gloomy and trembled all over. Jiwon put a finger to her mouth, sweated slightly, and nervously said that now they have 2 options. The beauty queen's soldier knelt down and lowered her head and began coughing up blood. Jiwon added that they could leave the incarnation of a guy named Kwang Chang to die, and the notification that appeared said that the H-wearing constellation standing until the last was worried. The warrior girl clenched her teeth tightly, looked straight ahead fiercely, and Dokja shouted, "What is she talking about?" During the reenactment, the events that happened at the Battle of H. Wangin Ball would be repeated. The main character slightly raised his head and added that the death of the guy in Kwangchang would raise the morale of the Silla army as it was then, or they can change history. The beauty queen looked confidently at the protagonist and asked, "What if we failed?" To which the protagonist replied, "Silla would lose." Ji-won opened her mouth wide and began to walk towards the protagonist and shouted furiously that then of course he was the first. And Kim, taking the disc in his hands, said that it didn't matter what she thought. Dokja looked at the beauty queen carefully, clenched his teeth slightly, and noticed that he had already chosen the second method. Jiwon shouted why there was even a need to ask. The disc in the hands of the protagonist began to glow brightly, and Dokja replied that he simply gave it a chance. Now it was of little use. The entire squad thoughtfully stared at the protagonist, and a new notification reported that the unique effect of the item Kangpyeong Yui had been activated. The disc in the hands of the protagonist glowed brightly, and constellations and notifications appeared in front of him that said he could request help from the great constellation. If he agreed, the number of requests would be reduced by 1, and the constellation had the right to refuse him. Dokja thought that Kangpyeong Yi was an observation device behind the celestial bodies created in the 17th century. Everyone is busy searching for the Sword of the Four Tigers, but the truly important item is here. Van turned in surprise and looked carefully at the protagonist after he said that he was calling on the constellation, and the notification said that the great constellations were listening to his voice. Van suddenly stood up straight, looked at the protagonist, and shouted, "What is he doing?" GCK, holding his sword in front of him and furiously looking at the enemy, shouted that he would protect the protagonist and let the beauty queen also stand behind him. The main character put a luminous disc in front of him and said that he was calling on the king of H-War, the great Heungmu. A moment later, the whole sky was covered with bright stars, and everyone looked up in surprise. Dokja looked carefully at several bright stars, and notifications reported that the stars had begun to move. One of the stars glowed brightly and made a loud sound. The main character made a confident face, clutched the disc in his hands after notifying that the constellation Great General Heungmu was looking at him. A statue of a warrior on a horse appeared in the protagonist's head, and he shouted in his thoughts, "The king of H-War, Kimin!" Dokja opened his mouth slightly and looked at the sky in horror after being notified that the constellation Great General Heungmu did not want to interfere with current events. The main character opened his mouth wide and shouted for the general to wait, and the notice added that the constellation Great General Heungmu was preparing to refuse him. S opened her mouth wide, looked carefully at the star, and shouted that the legends about the general were simply incredible. She had read many books about his life, and the main character looked at her in surprise. The girl opened her mouth even wider, and looking at the sky, added that he was right, that he respects history that has already happened. But history doesn't end the moment it is written down. Doesn't he have regrets? Wang dealt a powerful blow to the protagonist's comrade, and S added that he had already forgotten about the sacrifice of young H. Waring and the battlefield strewn with the bodies of Sela soldiers. The star in the sky lit up brighter after the girl's words. That, of course, the past cannot be rewritten, but his help today can change the course of the battle and save many lives. And then a notification appeared that the constellation Great General Heungmu was listening to the words of the incarnation of Sam. The star looked carefully at the girl and the main character, and Heungmu noticed that the Battle of Chu Wangin Ball was over for them, but for them, it was just beginning. Dokja turned his surprised gaze to the girl, opened his mouth slightly, and noticed in his head that if you think about it like that, during the internship, Sun had the nickname Presentation Queen. How good it was that he took her. A new notification reported that the constellation Great General Heungmu was silently closing his eyes. A moment later, a bright ray of light fell from the sky on the protagonist. Dokja carefully looked up and sees a notification that says that the constellation Great General Heungmu is responding to his request. The main character sharply raises his head upward, opens his mouth wide in pain, and notices in his head that it seems that his heart is about to explode. The notification said that the Great General Heungmu had granted him his blessing. A moment later, in the darkness of the mind, a voice was heard that noticed that this was just the repentance of an old man who could not forget the past. Powerful currents of air appeared around the protagonist, and General Heungmu asked the protagonist to lend his voice. The entire protagonist squad stared at him in surprise. All the warriors looked away from the battle and looked at the protagonist in horror. Sun looked carefully at the sparkling protagonist and called out to him in horror. Van opened his mouth wide and stared at the protagonist, frozen in horror. The main character suddenly raised his eyes and looked straight ahead furiously. Yen, in the body of the protagonist, began to slowly draw his sword from its sheath, and looking carefully directly, noticed that he had not seen Kek for a long time. Wang, without closing his mouth, looked at him in surprise. The warrior girl opened her mouth wide and screamed loudly, leaning on her comrade. And Usin noticed that H. Waring Quan didn't show him respect. The main character looked carefully at the sky and noticed that, what an irony, the story is already hidden in the centuries, and why they all gathered again in this place. Van suddenly fell to his knees, putting his hand to his chest, laughed loudly, and then asked what he really didn't know. A moment later, the guy's eyes lit up with a red light. He put his sword in front of him and, with his mouth wide open, shouted that everything was in order to meet him again on this battlefield. A blue ghost appeared behind the protagonist and introduced himself as the commander of the 15th H-Wearing Detachment, Kim Yusin. Uwin sharply put the burning sword in front of him, looked straight ahead fiercely, and said that he would calm the soul of the poor constellation and correct history. The notice said that the power of the Blue Dragon's sacred sword temporarily envelops the indestructible faith. The main character stood firmly on his feet, slammed it on the ground, and shouted to the young Hua Hyangdu squad. A moment later, Yen stabbed the glowing sword into the ground. An electric charge went through the ground, and Yusin added that they should return to the battlefield. Then skeletal arms began to burst out of the ground. Several skeletons crawled out of the ground and confidently stood up straight. A huge legion of skeletons appeared in front of the main characters, and a notification noted that the stigma of summoning the great H-Wearing had been activated. The beauty queen put her hand to her mouth in horror and began to look around. The protagonist's opponents gritted their teeth in horror and looked straight ahead furiously. Yen slightly opened his mouth in the protagonist's body and ordered his warriors to move forward. A moment later, a huge armada of skeletons began to quickly cope with ordinary people. It was a dark night outside, and only a few people were walking near the huge building. A guy with dark hair suddenly came out from around the corner, wearing an invisibility cloak. A moment later, he opened his eyes wide and looked straight ahead in horror. He saw how skeletons confidently chopped people into pieces. Van opened his mouth slightly and spat out blood. Yusin looked carefully at how two skeletons pierced the enemy with spears and asked why Quebec penetrated into his incarnation. Forgot about the rule of probability. The body of the main character looked carefully at the half-dead enemy and added that now, if his incarnation dies, he will die with him. And Dokja noticed in his head that he was right. Even to him, who had read the entire novel, this seemed strange. The main character opened his mouth slightly and heard Van notice that Yusin did not know about this world, and Dokja wondered what it meant about this world. Van raised his head wide, opened his bloody mouth, and noticed that he was offended. Could he really not be able to reach him, even on this fake stage? He just wanted to fight him. Sam looked carefully at the skeletons and said that the textbook said that General Kick's special detachment had never lost to the detachment of a general named Gin until the day of the Battle of Chu Wangin Ball. The girl looked carefully at the man's corpse in her pool of blood and added that as far as she remembers, that day General Kex was never able to fight a general named Yen one-on-one. Now it is clear why he is so offended. Yen sharply extended the sword in his hand directly at his opponent, and the main character noticed in his head that someone could call a general named Usun a coward, but he remained persistent. Even in the face of the fear of defeat, he did not succumb to emotions and was able to win at the very end. The spirit of the protagonist next to him opened his mouth wide and noticed that you can't kill him with your hands. He has a limitation. Yen, looking carefully, directly noticed that he understands and promises in the name of the stars. The general abruptly called the skeleton to him and added that if he insists, the skeleton raised his sword behind his head, and Yusin, looking carefully at the enemy, noticed that he believed they would meet again. A moment later, Wang lost his head from a blow from a skeleton, and the notices said that the reenactment was over. He was able to experience the Battle of Chu Wangin Ball. A reward of 1,000 coins was received. He refrained from killing. The king's privilege without death was deserved. Yusin took his sword to the side and, looking carefully straight at the corpses of the warriors, saw a notice that said that the blessing would disappear in 3 minutes. Duck S and Gil began to quickly run towards the protagonist and shouted, and Dokja turned at them, opened his mouth slightly, and noticed that they had little time, so they were moving straight north. He had already sent a soldier from the detachment of a general named Yusin there. A moment later, a crowd of skeletons began to cut down all living people on the way. Then a notification appeared that provided information about that. Thanks for watching. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated. And hey, drop a comment if you have thoughts or new ideas or just want to say hi. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.